So in this short video, I just wanted to explain how to add some clothes to the puppet. So let's get a puppet, and remember to turn on the grid, because it's quite important that you stamp the puppet on the grid. I'm just stamping it in the center, but you don't have to stamp it exactly in the center. So now what you need to do is to make sure that you are in the puppet scope correctly to adjust a few things. In this case, to access the individual parts of the puppet, you need to first scope into the puppet, and then you can turn mirror on, and then when you move the one side of the puppet's connectors, the other side automatically moves the same direction. So here I'm doing the hand, and the other hand automatically changes. Feet, just to show you an example of how it works. So I've kind of posed the puppet in this sort of arms out place so that it's ready to do the clothing sculpting. So I'm cloning the puppet to the right so that I've got the puppet that I want to place the clothing on the right hand side, and I'm actually going to use the puppet on the left to re-sculpt it to make the clothing. So you choose a body part, like in this case I selected the forearm, and I'll be adding sort of a bracer, leather bracer sort of idea. It's going to look really terrible, but it's just to show you the concept. So you're actually sculpting inside the part of the puppet. So I'll explain how that can turn into a piece of clothing just a little bit later. So for example, let's say we're just doing a front sort of section. So I'm just adding a couple of flattened spheres just to create some sort of a shape that you can sort of see how to do it. There we go. And what you noticed is that it's sculpted on both sides at the same time, because by default the puppet is linked parts. So if you edit the one side, it automatically edits the other side. So now to transfer the piece of clothing, we have to duplicate those two parts that I selected together. But as you can see, it's still part of the puppet, so we need to kind of remove it from the puppet. And it's a little bit tricky, so what you do is you select them and then you press L1 and circle to scope them out of the puppet. And then you can see they're not connected to the puppet anymore. They can now move on their own. They're just two pieces of sculpt that's on the grid, and they're completely disconnected from the original puppet, as you can see. So now we can also remove the base of the puppet so that only the clothing is left, so all the little blue parts. So it's actually quite handy that the puppet is blue, so you can see what's the clothing part and what's the puppet part. And now you can keep it on the grid, and when you move it to the other puppet, which is also on the grid, it's in exactly the same position where you sculpted it. It's just not part of the puppet. Now we need to add it to the puppet, and this is where it's getting a little bit tricky. So this piece is separate. Now we need to move it 2 levels deep, first into the puppet, so now it's part of the puppet, and then the other one you hold on the grid and you scope in, and that's how you get it inside the puppet. But it's still not part of the arm. So if you move the arm, it's not going to move with the puppet. So how do you fix that? So you have to be really careful how you do this, because you're not allowed to move your cursor while you're doing this movement. You have to press L1 and X to go into the puppet, right? And then you press L1 and X again to make it part of the actual body part. So that was inside the puppet. Just to show this again, yes, it's part of the puppet now, but it's not part of the arm. So now you select, now you're inside the puppet, you know that purple ring appears. Now you select the clothing part, make sure that the actual body part is visible in the same, and then scope in. It doesn't make a sound, so you have to be really careful. And then you'll see it is. And then when you scope out, you'll see puppet. Scope out again, you'll see no puppet ring. So now you know that you've done it twice, and it's inside the actual arm. So now if you move the arm, it moves as part of the arm. Then you do exactly the same thing on the other side, and remember to use the grid. You scope in, and then you scope into the actual body part of the puppet. So now they're grouped together. Don't use the grouping feature, like selecting the two parts and pressing group, because that will break the puppet. And as you can see, that still doesn't work correctly. What we need to do is we need to make the body part that we just added, which is the clothing, we have to make it non-movable. There we go. Sorry, I accidentally clicked the visibility one as well. So just not movable, because by default the puppet parts are movable and we moved it, so we have to undo the movable part. Cool. And then it will stay inside, but the group together, the two parts, the arm and the clothing, is movable. So I'm just showing you that. And then just to double check, the original part must also be non-movable now. Yes. And let's check the other side as well. Also not movable. The group which they both belong to is movable. So now it's perfectly connected to the arm. And there's your bracers. And now to show you that you can now further sculpt. So let's go back to sculpting. And before I do that, I want to show you how that it's still connected. So there are still linked parts, which means if you edit the one side, you see if you go to the live clone feature, you'll see it's green, which means they're linked. So editing the one part will edit the other part. So let's add like little spikes to the end of the bracers, and then it'll just show you how you can then further edit the clothing after it's been attached to the puppet. In this case, I'm just going to make like a little spike. It's just a flattened cone, just to show you how it's done. There we go. And that's it. And now you can actually test it with the puppet and possess the puppet, and you'll see the clothing will move with the puppet. It's just doing a little funny move for the default pose.